My team and I conducted a thorough, independent investigation. We identified evidence that the president willfully retained classified materials after the end of his vice presidency when he was a private citizen. This evidence included an audio-recorded conversation during which Mr. Biden told his ghostwriter that he had, quote, just found all the classified stuff downstairs, end quote. When Mr. Biden said this, he was a private citizen speaking to his ghostwriter in his private rental home in Virginia.
That sounds bad. I found the classified stuff. Joining me now, my buddy Josh Hammer, host of America on Trial with Josh Hammer. Josh, look, I'm not a legal mind like you. I went to community college, but that sounds really bad.
Yeah, look, Jesse, I mean, Joe Biden's conduct here was obviously disgraceful. And, you know, a lot of people are trying to compare what Donald Trump did to what Joe Biden did. And a lot of the mainstream media talking points, a lot of what the Democratic congressmen were saying there to Robert Hur in that testimony yesterday is they're saying, oh, Donald Trump's actions were so much worse. And, you know, let's grant that there is some conduct alleged in Jack Smith's indictment, and it's just alleged conduct. He has a right to defend himself. But, for example, he alleges that Trump ignored a grand jury subpoena. You can't do that, obviously. Having said that there is some alleged conduct that looks kind of bad at first sight, let's remember that Trump was the president of the United States at the time that he was involved in this classified documents tussle with the National Archives. If you were the president of the United States, you have the, quote, executive power that Article 2, Section 1, Clause 1 of the Constitution speaks, and you have inherent constitutional authority outside of any statutory or regulatory regime. You have inherent constitutional authority to make classification and declassification decisions. Joe Biden, at the time that he was hoarding classified documents, was not the commander-in-chief. He did not have the executive power. He was a senator from Delaware and then Barack Obama's vice president. That is a huge difference there, a massive key distinction that I fear that many are eliding over. Now, look, I don't necessarily disagree, Jesse, with Robert Hur's bottom line conclusion not to recommend charges. And I think that he was right to do what he did in terms of talking about Joe Biden's his mentality, his senile mindset. He didn't use the word senile, but all of that is legally relevant in order to convince a jury. Robert Hur is correct about that. I guess that the point that I would make here is that when the media is comparing Biden and Trump side by side when it comes to their various classified documents scandals, they're really missing the forest for the trees. Did Trump act perfectly? Maybe not. Maybe we'll have a trial to kind of tease that out. But importantly, Jesse, he was the president of the United States when this happened. Joe Biden was not. That's a very important distinction.
You thought this exchange, you talk about this on your podcast, you thought this exchange between Darrell Issa and Hur was interesting. Here it was.
I'm going to presume that you would never prosecute someone you thought was outright innocent.
Correct.
In this case, did you reach a conclusion that this man was outright innocent?
That conclusion is not reflected in my report, sir.
You did not reach an idea that he had committed no wrong. You reached a conclusion that you would not prevail at trial and therefore did not take it forward. Is that correct?
Correct, Congressman.
Okay, Josh, now, for the average American who does not know the law the way you know the law, what you just said and what that exchange just said has them pulling their hair out and ready to jump off a bridge. What does any of that mean? He committed a crime. You just said he committed a crime, but the guy who's pretending to be president is too mentally broken to stand trial? That's a legitimate thing?
So, look, Jesse, I'm not a prosecutor. I've never been a prosecutor, but based on my conversations with prosecutors, they do agree that it is a curious and unusual thing to put into a prosecutorial report. But that was his decision. That was his decision to say that based on what he saw from Joe Biden, based on the fact that Joe Biden was talking about how he couldn't remember when Beau Biden died without any prompting, how he was talking about how he couldn't remember when he was vice president, when the election was in November 2017. He saw someone who was just totally out to lunch and who was essentially unfit to stand trial. And I think that he was within his rights to offer that conclusion. Now, there's a few other things to bear in mind here. One, Jesse, and this is kind of the key point that I actually can't figure out about this entire Robert Hur special counsel investigation going back over a year now. It is longstanding Department of Justice policy going all the way back to the Richard Nixon administration. There's a 1973 memo that Richard Nixon's Office of Legal Counsel, which are basically the highfalutin lawyers within the White House counsel's office, they issued a memo in kind of the context of the whole Watergate scandal that a sitting president cannot be indicted as a constitutional matter for a crime. That conclusion was reiterated in a 2000 memo from the Bill Clinton Office of Legal Counsel, and it remains good law, good Department of Justice policy to this day. I think that policy happens to be constitutionally correct. I guess one question that I have, Jesse, I've never gotten a straight answer on this, is if you know that you're not going to actually indict him, then why do this in the first place? And the only answer that I have is because Democrats simultaneously with Jack Smith's prosecution of Trump in D.C. are actually trying to establish the precedent of then prosecuting a president after he is president for the actions he took while he was president. So if they are successful in establishing that precedent in D.C., then maybe you can prosecute Joe Biden for after this. But I haven't been able to figure that one out here as well. In any event, Jesse, I think that Robert Hur did an overall pretty good job yesterday. I do.
All right, let's move on to what's happening tomorrow. There's a huge hearing in the Trump classified documents case. The rest of us can't follow along with all this stuff, Josh. That's the point of your podcast. What's happening?
Yeah, big hearing in Judge Aileen Cannon's courtroom in Fort Pierce, Florida tomorrow. So this is Trump's classified documents case. It is the lesser discussed of Donald Trump's two federal prosecutions. Most people talk about Jack Smith's probe in D.C., and there's going to be a huge hearing at the Supreme Court in about a month and a half when it comes to the immunity question there. In the D.C. probe, does Trump have immunity for what we just discussed because he was president? But here tomorrow, we're talking about the classified documents case. And basically, Trump's lawyers are trying to dismiss this indictment. They're saying that the statute that Jack Smith is talking about, which is a World War I era statute called the Espionage Act. Jesse, this is a statute that prosecutors typically invoke when it comes to people like Bradley, Chelsea Manning, whatever we're calling him or her, folks like Jack Teixeira, the Air Force Discord leaker. It is not a pretty statute. So the fact that Jack Smith went there to try to prosecute a former president is absolutely absurd, totally overshooting the mark. And Trump's lawyers are arguing that this invocation of the Espionage Act is unconstitutionally void for vagueness. But more interestingly, what they're doing in this hearing in Judge Cannon's courtroom tomorrow, they're making an argument that myself, Mike Davis, and some other lawyers have made, which is that we think that the actual relevant law to govern the relations when it comes to classified documents between a president and the National Archives is a civil statute from the late 70s, early 80s called the Presidential Records Act, which is a civil, not a criminal statute. Many of us have said that that is actually the statute that should govern this conduct. And if Judge Cannon actually accepts that, that really would nullify, if not throw out, much of Jack Smith's prosecution. So as a legal nerd, Jesse, I'm very excited to finally see this argument get the light of day that I think that it has deserved for a long time, at least since that August 2022 pre-dawn FBI raid at Mar-a-Lago. And hopefully Judge Cannon reaches a conclusion. In any event, the Florida trial, Jesse, is looking pretty good for Trump because the timeline, it's very, very unlikely to reach a verdict prior to November. And even if they do reach a verdict prior to November, it's a very politically mixed juror pool there in the Fort Pierce, Florida area. I think Trump overall, for all of these reasons, is looking pretty good in the Florida prosecution.
Okay, wrap this one up for us then, Josh. What happened in the Fani Willis trial today? Everyone's looking at the headlines. A bunch of charges were thrown out. Is Trump scot-free? Doesn't have to worry about Georgia anymore?
He's not off the hook yet. So, there were a lot of counts in Georgia. I think it was roughly 30 to 40 counts specifically against Donald Trump in the state of Georgia. They're prosecuting him there under the state's RICO statute. RICO at a federal level, when it comes to the U.S. Congress, it's an anti-racketeering statute. It was essentially developed by Congress in the middle of the 20th century when it comes to Congress's attempts to crack down on La Cosa Nostra, on organized crime and the mafia. So that's literally the statute, or the Georgia equivalent of that statute, that they are invoking to prosecute Trump and his alleged co-conspirators. So there's a lot of counts there. What happened today was Judge Scott McAfee, who's supposed to issue his ruling probably this week, probably Thursday or Friday, when it comes to whether or not Fani Willis and Nathan Wade are disqualified. Today, he threw out 6 of the counts. But again, it's 6 out of 30, 40, whatever the precise exact number is. So Trump's not clear yet. The counts today that they threw out were basically solicitation of a public official to violate the oath. So Fani here was prosecuting Trump and some others for allegedly soliciting Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, to violate his oath when it came to that infamous phone call on January 3rd, 2021 to quote unquote find more votes in Georgia. McAfee basically says there's just not enough here. So these counts are thrown out, but unfortunately Trump's not off the hook in Georgia quite yet.